Clara's hands slammed the mortgage contract flat against the desk so hard the candle jumped. Her breath came in short, hard pulls. 11 families, 11 forged signatures, 11 parcels of land sitting directly in the railroad's path. And every single deed transfer had Warren Cole's fingerprints buried in the fine print where nobody who couldn't read a legal document down to the last subordinate clause, would ever find them. Her chair scraped back. She stood, walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the cold glass and said, out loud, to nobody, "You son of a bitch." Before we go any further with Clara's story, please subscribe to our channel and stay with us until the very end. Drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Clara. She had told herself, boarding the westbound stage in St. Louis with $43 and a carpet bag held together by determination and fraying leather straps, that she was done being the woman who trusted too much, done being the woman who read contracts for a living, and somehow failed to read the man sleeping next to her. Gerald Ashford had handed her documents for 2 years, smiling that particular smile of his, the one she'd mistaken for pride in her ability. And she had signed every one, without question, because she had loved him. That was the part she couldn't forgive herself for. Not the bankruptcy proceedings, not the investigation, not the morning she'd walked into Whitmore and Cross Legal and found her desk cleared and her key no longer fitting the lock. The part that kept her awake was simpler and worse than any of that. She had been good at her work, genuinely, remarkably good, and she had let love make her blind to the one thing she should have seen coming. She wasn't going to be blind again. Silverbend, New Mexico Territory, in August of 1878, was a town held together by stubbornness and not much else. Ruth Weston had met her at the stage stop with the economy of a woman who'd stopped decorating her words sometime around 1860. "You're the one who answered the clerk posting." "Clara Ashford. Yes, ma'am." Ruth had looked her over the way you look at a fence you're considering trusting your weight to. "You can actually read legal documents. Not just read, understand them." "I worked 4 years at a law firm in St. Louis." "What happened to that position?" Clara had met her eyes without blinking. "My husband happened." Ruth had picked up one end of Clara's trunk without being asked. "Room's $12 a month, meals included. Mayor Holt's office is second building past the dry goods." She'd paused at the door. "Silverbend's got a particular kind of trouble right now." "What kind?" "The kind that wears a good suit and holds your mortgage." Clara had wanted to ask more. She hadn't. The answers that mattered most were the ones you found yourself. Mayor Gerald Holt had hired her in under 10 minutes, which should have felt like luck and instead felt like a man drowning and grabbing whatever was closest. His hand shook slightly when he mentioned the territorial assessor's visit in 6 weeks. The previous clerk had left without notice. The filing system was in a condition Clara recognized immediately. Not disorganized the way honest neglect produced, but confused in a deliberate pattern. Documents misfiled by date. Cross-references severed. The mortgage ledger from Cole's bank and the official land registry separated into different boxes with different filing dates, as though someone had worked carefully to make sure they could never be read together. She'd started building her own index that same afternoon. "You're staying late again," Ruth said from the doorway at 7:30, holding a plate covered with a cloth napkin. "I brought supper." "Thank you." Clara didn't look up from the ledger. "Mrs. Weston, how long has Warren Cole been the only banker in this territory?" Ruth set the plate on the corner of the desk. "Going on 6 years. Why?" "Just getting a sense of the landscape." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "When you find what I think you're going to find," she said, "you come talk to me before you talk to anyone else. You hear me?" Clara looked up then. "What do you think I'm going to find?" But Ruth had already gone, and the question sat in the lamplight unanswered, and Clara had turned back to the ledger because the numbers were already starting to tell her exactly what Ruth already knew. It was on the fourth day that she'd nearly gone under Daniel's horse. She had been crossing the street fast, head down, list in hand, and the horse had come out of nowhere, and she'd stumbled backward and would have gone straight down into the dirt if a hand hadn't caught her arm from behind. She'd spun and pulled free before she'd registered anything about the man except that he was tall and had moved quickly, and had immediately stepped back with both hands raised, which was not what a man with bad intentions did. "Easy. Palms out. Steady voice. Just keeping you out of the street, ma'am." "I had my footing." "Another half-second you wouldn't have." She'd looked at him properly then. Lean, dark-haired, a scar along his jaw that had healed clean a long time ago. A hat pulled low, and on his vest, the faded shadow where a badge had once been pinned. She noticed things like that, always had. The shapes left behind by what was no longer there. "Eli Callaway," he said. Just the name, flat and plain, no hand extended, no performance. "Clara Ashford. I'm the new clerk at the mayor's office." Something had shifted in his expression, the smallest tightening around the eyes. "How long you been in that office?" 4 days. "Find anything interesting yet?" The question was too specific. Clara had studied him for a moment, the way she studied documents, looking for what didn't match. "I find everything interesting, Mr. Callaway. That's generally why I'm good at my job." She'd walked around him without another word, but she'd felt his eyes on her back until she'd pushed through the dry goods door, and the feeling had stayed with her considerably longer than she'd wanted it to. Ruth had answered her questions about him that evening, over a supper neither of them was fully concentrating on. "Pinkerton man," Ruth said. "Before he came here. Left 2 years ago." "He left voluntarily?" "He left because Pinkerton asked him to bury a case. Family named Gruber, up in Colorado." Eli built the proof of what happened to their land, had it all documented and ready. And the agency killed it because the railroad had friends where it mattered. Ruth paused. The Gruber father didn't survive losing that land. Clara set down her fork. "And Eli's been carrying that ever since." "You can see it if you know what to look for." Ruth looked at her directly. "Question is whether a man who watched the system fail once has anything left in him to try again." "Is he trustworthy?" 2 years I've known Eli Callaway. Never once seen him say a thing he didn't mean." Ruth stood and collected the plates. "That's rarer than water in a dry summer out here. I remember it." Clara had lain awake that night thinking about men who meant what they said. In her experience, they were rarer than Ruth knew. Warren Cole had come into the mayor's office the next morning, and Clara had understood in the first 30 seconds exactly what she was dealing with. He was 52, well-fed, white-haired, and expensively dressed for a man 400 miles from the nearest city that would have appreciated the suit. He walked like every door he'd ever approached had opened before he reached it. He smiled at Clara, the way powerful men smile at women they've already decided don't matter. And she'd smiled back, with the professional warmth she'd spent 4 years perfecting, in a room full of men exactly like him. "Miss Ashford, Warren Cole, Silverbend Savings and Trust. I wanted to welcome you personally." "That's very kind, Mr. Cole." He glanced at the stacks of documents on her desk. Casual. Practiced. The look of a man who'd trained himself to appear uninterested in things he was intensely interested in. Quite a project. Gerald Holt's filing system has always been somewhat creative. "I've dealt with worse." "I'm sure you have. A woman with your background." Just a half beat too long on the word background. Just enough to remind her that he'd asked about her history, and she should be aware he knew things. Some of the older mortgage documents can be confusing to someone unfamiliar with local practice. If you need context on any of the bank's transactions, don't hesitate. Clara looked at him directly. I appreciate that, Mr. Cole. Though in my experience, documents explain themselves clearly enough once they're arranged in the proper order. The smile held. Completely, perfectly held. And that was the tell. A man with nothing to worry about didn't work that hard at a smile. Of course. Welcome to Silverbend, Miss Ashford. He walked out, and Clara turned to a fresh page in her personal notebook and wrote the time and date and the exact words he'd said. Because when something started feeling like what this was starting to feel like, you documented everything from the beginning, and you did not stop. She found the first forgery 3 days later. Homer Bell's file. Grain farmer, 80 acres east of town, borrowed against his land 2 years prior, currently 6 weeks from foreclosure, on a modification agreement that had changed his repayment terms and added an accelerated foreclosure clause that the original contract had never contained. She'd pulled the original contract first, standard practice, always read the original before the amendments, and there it was. Homer Bell had signed the original with a large, careful X, pressed so hard the pen had nearly gone through the paper. The mark of a man who'd held a pen exactly once in his life and wanted to make sure it counted. The signature on the modification was flowing, practiced, H-O-M, in the looping, confident hand of someone who wrote their name every single day. Clara had set both documents side by side on the desk and sat very still for a long moment. Homer Bell could not write his name. He had never in his life signed that modification agreement. Someone had done it for him, and that someone had then used the forged document to begin the legal process of taking everything Homer Bell owned. She'd worked through the night. By the time the sky outside her window turned gray, she had 11 separate mortgage modifications, with signatures that didn't match the original marks. 11 families. And a railroad survey map she'd reconstructed from registry filings and correspondence that she never should have had access to if someone had been paying closer attention to what the previous clerk had misfiled. Every single parcel, sitting directly in the projected path, worth 10 times its current value the moment that railroad announcement became public. She'd put everything in order, hidden her personal notes inside the lining of her carpet bag, gone downstairs, and sat at Ruth's kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. You found it, Ruth said. Not a question. 11 counts of fraud that I can document. Probably more I haven't reached yet. Clara looked up. He forged the signatures of people who can't read what was done to them. Homer Bell signed his original contract with an X. Ruth had sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence had the particular weight of two women who both understood that knowing the truth and being able to prove it in a territory where the only banker also held the judge's mortgage were two entirely different problems. There's one person in Silverbend who spent years building exactly this kind of case, Ruth said finally. Knows land fraud law. Knows how to build evidence that holds up. Knows this territory. She stood, slow and deliberate. East Road, 2 miles out. White fence, red barn. Clara rode out that afternoon. Eli was mending fence along the road and straightened when he heard her coming, and she dismounted before she'd even consciously decided to, because this was not a conversation to have from horseback. Mr. Callaway, I need to ask you something directly. I don't give any other kind of answer. Warren Cole is forging mortgage documents, using them to foreclose on families whose land sits in the railroad's path. I have 11 counts documented, with original contracts and modified agreements side by side. Homer Bell signed his original with an X. The modification has a cursive signature. She watched his face. Did you know? Eli's jaw tightened. He set down his fence tool with the careful deliberateness of a man managing something strong. I suspected. 2 years ago, I started tracking which farms were failing and which weren't. But suspicion without the documents. Yes. I have the documents. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than most moments. Then he crossed to where she stood and held out his hand. And she gave him the copied files, and he read them. All of them. Standing at the fence in the afternoon light, not rushing, turning each page the way a man turns pages when he knows exactly what he's reading and is making sure he hasn't missed anything. When he finished, he stacked them carefully. You rebuilt the railroad survey path yourself, he said. 4 hours. Registry filings and the correspondence records. How long ago did you find all this? I've been awake since yesterday morning. Eli looked at her, and something moved across his face that had nothing easy in it. Something that had been kept very still for a long time, and was deciding whether to move again. Cole's going to figure out what you found. When he does, I know. You came out here anyway. I came out here because 11 families are about to lose their land to forged documents, and I am the only person in Silverbend who can prove what those documents actually say. She met his eyes and didn't look away. I'm not asking you to protect me, Mr. Callaway. I'm asking you to work with me. You know the law. You know the territory. You know how to get evidence to someone who can act on it. I know what those documents say, and I can prove it in front of any court in this territory. She paused. The Gruber family lost because you didn't have a partner who could read the paperwork fast enough. I'm telling you, I can read it. Something cracked open behind his eyes then. Just briefly. Just enough for her to see what it had cost him. That case. That failure. The man who hadn't survived it. I have a contact in the territorial marshal's office, Eli said, his voice lower. Man named Webb. Honest, which out here is worth more than it sounds. But he'll need originals, not copies. Full documentation on all 11 transactions. He looked at the files in his hand. Cole's already suspicious of you. He came to the office. First morning I was there. Then we've got less time than you think. He handed the files back. 3 days. Can you have the full case built in 3 days? I can have it in 2. He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he wants to trust and isn't sure yet that he should. Then, very quietly, my contact in Cheyenne. If Cole finds out you've been to see me before we get word to Webb, he won't find out tonight. Clara put the files back in her saddlebag. Tomorrow, I go back into that office. I pulled the quarterly bank ledgers. I have legal access to them. They're filed with the mayor. And I finish building the case from inside his own records. Every number Cole reported to the territory is in those files. He's never had a clerk who could read what they actually said. Eli was quiet for a moment. A hawk crossed the sky above them, slow and certain. I'll reach out to Webb tonight, he said finally. Clara remounted and gathered the reins. She was halfway down the road when she heard him call after her. Miss Ashford! She turned in the saddle. Be careful walking back to the boarding house tonight. His voice was flat, not dramatic, the voice of a man stating a fact. Cole had a man watching the mayor's office this afternoon. I saw him on my way into town. The words landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, the rings spreading outward, slow and cold. Cole already knew. She kept her face still, nodded once, and rode toward Silverbend as the sun went down red behind the mountains. And she did not let herself think about what it meant that a man who forged the signatures of people who couldn't read was already watching the one woman in town who could. Until she was back in her room with the door bolted and her notes laid out in front of her, and the full weight of what she'd started pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. 11 families, 2 days, one contact in Cheyenne who might or might not get there in time. And somewhere in Silverbend tonight, a man in Warren Cole's employ who had watched her walk in and out of that office all day and had reported back everything he'd seen. Clara picked up her pen. She had work to do. She worked until 2 in the morning, and then she worked some more. The quarterly bank ledgers were spread across the desk in the order she'd reconstructed them. 18 months of numbers that told a story Warren Cole had never intended anyone to read. The thing about fraud built on paper was that paper remembered everything. You could forge a signature. You could bury a clause in subordinate language on page 4 of a 6-page document. You could count on the fact that the people you were stealing from couldn't read well enough to catch you, but the numbers still had to reconcile. Somewhere in the chain of transactions, the money still had to go somewhere, and when Clara traced where it went, following the thread from the bank's reported assets to the actual land transfers to the accelerated foreclosure filings, the picture that emerged was so deliberate, so systematic, that she had to set down her pen and press both hands flat on the desk and breathe for a moment just to steady herself. Cole hadn't just been stealing land. He'd been building an inventory, parcel by parcel, family by family. Always the ones who'd borrowed against their property. Always the ones least likely to fight back. Always timed so the foreclosure proceedings landed in the same 2-month window, just ahead of what Clara now understood would be the official railroad survey announcement. When that announcement came, Warren Cole would own a corridor of land worth 50 times what he'd paid for it, acquired through documents that looked legal to anyone who didn't know what a forged subordinate clause looked like. 11 families, probably more, and a banker who already had someone watching her. She'd copied every relevant ledger entry twice, once in her own shorthand and once in plain language clear enough for a territorial judge to follow without a legal background. She'd cross-referenced each entry against the forged modification agreements. She'd written a summary document, 4 pages, that laid out the entire scheme from first transaction to present in language that moved in a straight line from evidence to conclusion, with no room for reasonable doubt in between. Then she'd hidden everything except her working notes inside the false bottom of her carpet bag. The same false bottom Gerald had never known about. The one small piece of foresight she'd had in that marriage that had turned out to matter. She'd gone to bed at 2:30 and lain awake until 4, thinking about Cole's man watching the office. In the morning, she'd gone downstairs to find Eli Callaway sitting at Ruth's kitchen table drinking coffee. She'd stopped in the doorway. "Morning," he said. No apology for being there, no explanation. Just the word, flat and quiet, and a second cup already poured and sitting across from him. Clara had sat down and pulled the cup toward her. "You heard something." "Cole sent a rider to Cheyenne last night. One of his men left around midnight." Eli wrapped both hands around his cup. "I don't know yet who he's going to see there, but a man doesn't send a midnight rider unless something's changed in his calculations. He knows I've been looking at the ledgers. He knows you're capable of understanding them. Whether he knows what you found yet is a different question." Eli looked at her directly. "How close are you?" "I finished last night. Full documentation. 11 counts, summary brief, cross-referenced against the ledger entries." She met his eyes. "I need to get to the originals in the mayor's office today. The copies I have are good enough to show the pattern. The originals are what convict him." Ruth set a plate of biscuits between them without a word and went back to the stove, which was the closest she ever came to expressing anxiety. "Getting to the originals means going back into that office," Eli said, "with Cole's man watching. I work in that office. There's nothing unusual about me being there." There's nothing unusual about you being there at regular hours. You go in before dawn and stay until midnight 2 days in a row. Cole's man is going to report that, and Cole is going to know exactly what kind of work that kind of hours requires. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Then I need to look like I'm doing something other than what I'm doing. Eli was quiet for a moment. Mayor Holt has a county tax assessment he's been putting off for 3 months. Publicly miserable job. Requires pulling every property record in the office. He paused. Legitimate reason to be in those files all day. Completely explainable. Clara looked at him. You've been thinking about this since last night. I've been thinking about this since the day you rode out to my fence. He stood, set his cup in the basin. I'll be in town today. Not near the office. That would flag. But close enough. I know you don't need protection. His voice was even, not defensive. I'll be close enough that if something goes wrong, there's someone who knows what you were doing and why. That's not protection. That's backup. There's a difference. Clara looked at him for a moment. In her experience, men who made that distinction usually didn't mean it. Eli said it the way he said everything, like it was a simple fact that he had no interest in arguing about. Fine, she said. She was in the mayor's office by 8 o'clock, and by 8:15 she had pulled the county tax assessment files and spread them across 2 tables in a display of productive bureaucratic misery that she felt reasonably good about. The original mortgage documents were in the 3rd cabinet from the left. She worked through the tax files methodically, making real notes, because real work was the only convincing kind. And every 20 minutes, she found a reason to cross to the filing cabinets for a reference document. And every time she did, she removed one original file and slipped it into the tax assessment stack and kept moving. By noon, she had 9 of the 11 originals. She was reaching for the 10th when Mayor Holt appeared in the doorway, with Warren Cole standing directly behind him. Clara didn't move her hand from the cabinet. She finished pulling the file she'd been reaching for, a property tax record, legitimate, she'd planned for this, and turned around with it and set it on her stack, and looked at both men with the expression of a woman interrupted in the middle of tedious but necessary work. Miss Ashford. Holt's voice had the particular quality of a man being directed from just off stage. Mr. Cole was hoping to have a word. Of course. Clara sat down at her desk, folded her hands, and looked at Cole pleasantly. What can I do for you, Mr. Cole? Cole looked at the spread of files on the tables, at the stack on her desk. His eyes moved the way water finds a path. Not obviously, not in a straight line, but always moving toward the lowest point. Quite an undertaking. The county tax assessment. Mayor Holt mentioned it had been waiting. Holt made a small sound that might have been confirmation. I wanted to follow up on our conversation the other day, Cole said, about the bank's transaction records. I understand you've been reviewing the quarterly ledgers? As part of the assessment, yes. Property valuations require cross-referencing the financing records. Clara kept her voice entirely neutral. Standard procedure. I'm sure you'd find the same approach in any county clerk's office in the territory. Of course. That smile again, held too perfectly. I only mention it because some of those older ledger entries can be misread without context. I'd hate for any confusion to find its way into the official assessment. I appreciate your concern. Clara looked at him with the polite, empty attention she'd spent years perfecting on men who thought they were being subtle. I find that figures generally don't require much context, Mr. Cole. They either reconcile or they don't. Something moved behind his eyes, something that wasn't the smile at all. Indeed, he said. Well, I won't keep you from your work. He turned to go, then stopped, as if something had just occurred to him, which it hadn't. One more thing. I was sorry to hear about your difficulties back in St. Louis. A forgery investigation? That must have been a trying time. The room went very still. Clara held his gaze without blinking. "It was," she said. "I learned a great deal about how forgeries work, how they're constructed, how they're detected." She paused for exactly one beat. "Useful knowledge, as it turns out." Cole held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then he smiled, and it was the first time the smile had looked like something real. Not warmth, but acknowledgement. One player recognizing another. "Good day, Miss Ashford." He left, and Holt hovered in the doorway for a moment, looking like a man who wanted to apologize and didn't know how. And then he left too, and Clara turned back to her desk and sat very still until she was certain her hands had stopped trembling before she picked up her pen again. He knew. Not the specifics, not yet, but he knew she was a problem in a way he hadn't anticipated. The St. Louis comment had been a warning. I know your history. I know your vulnerability. I can use it. The question was how long she had before he decided warning wasn't enough. She had the 10th original before noon and the 11th by 2 o'clock. And by 3, she had the full set copied, cross-referenced, and the originals carefully replaced in their correct cabinet positions, filed exactly as she'd found them, and the complete documentation package assembled in her carpet bag with her personal copies and the summary brief. She walked out of the mayor's office at 4 o'clock at a completely normal pace, nodded to the 2 men on the porch of the hardware store across the street, one of whom she was fairly certain was Cole's, based on the 3rd morning in a row he'd been there, and went to the dry goods store to buy thread she didn't need and have a conversation about the weather with the woman behind the counter that she would never remember afterward. Eli fell into step beside her on the walk back to Ruth's. He didn't appear from anywhere dramatic. He was simply suddenly there, walking at a matching pace, his hat pulled low. "You get them?" "All 11, plus the ledger documentation and the summary brief." She didn't look at him. "Cole came to the office today, with Holt." "I know. I saw him go in." A pause. "How'd it go?" "He mentioned St. Louis, the forgery investigation." Eli's jaw tightened. She could see it from the corner of her eye. "He's trying to discredit you before you can use what you've got." "That's my read, too." "Which means he's closer to figuring out what you found than we thought." "Which means we need Webb here sooner than 3 days." Clara kept her voice low and her eyes forward. "Can you reach him tonight?" "I already did. Sent a rider this morning." Eli's voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "Webb can be here in 2 days if he rides hard." "But Clara, 2 days is a long time if Cole decides to move." It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss in front of it, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly and without comment, filing it somewhere. "Then we don't give him a reason to move tonight," she said. She went to supper at Ruth's and ate everything on her plate and helped clear the table and talked about the possibility of early autumn weather with a boarder named Cassius Pratt, who sold dry goods and had no idea what was happening 2 feet away from his pot roast. Ruth watched her from across the table with the steady attention of a woman keeping track of something important. After Cassius had retired and the kitchen was clean, Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. "Cole came by here this afternoon," she said, "after he left the mayor's office." Clara set down her cup. "What did he want?" "Asked how you were settling in, whether you'd mentioned what you were working on, whether you had any visitors." Ruth's expression didn't change. "I told him you kept to yourself, did your work, and hadn't said a word about anything except wanting more lamp oil." She paused. "He left $20 on the counter, said it was a contribution to the boarding house's upkeep." "What did you do with it?" "Put it in the envelope I'm keeping for Homer Bell's back taxes." Ruth looked at her steadily. "He's circling, Clara. A man like Cole doesn't make personal visits to boarding houses unless he's trying to control what information moves through them." "I know." How much time do you need?
2 days.
Eli's contact in the marshal's office is riding. Ruth nodded, once, the way she nodded when something was decided. Then you keep your routine tomorrow. Office in the morning, back by 5, supper at 6. Nothing changes. You give him nothing to react to. She stood and collected the cups. And you sleep tonight. You can't build a case if your hands are shaking from exhaustion. Clara had gone upstairs, intending to do exactly that, and had lain awake instead, staring at the ceiling, listening to Silverbend settle into its nighttime sounds. Somewhere in this town, a man who had stolen 11 families' futures was calculating his next move. Somewhere east of town, on a ranch with a white fence and a red barn, a man who'd watched the system betray him once was deciding whether to trust it again. And in a carpetbag under the floorboard beneath her bed, she'd pulled one board up the first night she'd arrived, another habit from a marriage that had taught her not to leave valuables where they could be found, was the complete documentation of everything Warren Cole had done, every forged signature, every falsified date, every family reduced to a number in a ledger entry. Homer Bell's X, pressed hard into paper he'd believed was protecting him. She'd thought about Homer Bell all night, about the particular cruelty of stealing from someone using their own inability to read against them. Using the legal language they'd trusted you to explain honestly as the weapon. Gerald had done the same thing to her in his way. He'd known she trusted her own professional judgment, and he'd used that trust as the mechanism of the crime. The thing that was supposed to protect you turned into the thing that destroyed you. Not this time. At 6 in the morning, she heard a soft knock at her door. Not Ruth's knock. Ruth knocked like a woman who'd decided something. This was quieter, more careful. She opened the door with her hand on the small knife she'd started keeping in her skirt pocket 3 days ago. Which was another thing she would not have imagined herself doing 6 months ago, and which now seemed entirely reasonable. Eli stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands, and his expression told her something had changed before he said a word. "Webb's not coming," he said. "My rider got back an hour ago. Webb left Cheyenne 4 days ago. Nobody knows where he is." He paused. "And this morning, 3 of Cole's men rode into town." Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. "They're staying at the saloon," Eli continued, his voice flat and careful, the way voices got when they were managing something that wanted to be urgent. "Armed. Cole hasn't left his bank since yesterday afternoon. He's not conducting business. The door's locked." He met her eyes. "He's done calculating, Clara. He's made a decision." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. I need to show you something." She pulled up the floorboard and laid the carpetbag on the bed and opened it. And Eli looked at what was inside. The full documentation, the originals she'd copied in the office, the summary brief, the ledger cross-references, and was quiet for a long moment. "If Webb isn't coming," Clara said, "we need to find another way to get this in front of someone with the authority to act on it. Who else is there?" Eli didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the documents with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something complicated working through him. Something that had to do with Colorado, and a case that had been built just as carefully as this one, and had been buried anyway. "Eli," she waited until he looked at her. "Who else is there?" He took a breath. "There's a federal circuit judge due in Copper Falls in 3 days, 40 miles east. Judge Harlan Price. He's been investigating Cole's dealings independently. Been trying to build probable cause for 2 years without enough to move on." He paused. "If we can get this documentation to Price before Cole moves on those remaining families—" "Then we ride to Copper Falls," Clara said. "Cole's men are watching the road." Then we don't use the road. Eli looked at her for a long moment. That same look from the fence. The one that was deciding whether to trust something it wanted to trust. And then something settled in his face. Quiet and certain. "There's a creek route," he said. "Takes longer, but Cole's men won't expect it." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on her desk. "We leave tonight, after dark, when the saloon's occupied and nobody's watching the Eastern Trail." He started for the door, then stopped. "Pack what you need. Nothing extra. We'll be riding hard."
Eli.
He turned. Clara had been about to say something practical, about the documents, about the route, about how many hours of daylight they'd have on the far side of the creek crossing. Instead, what came out was quieter than she'd intended.
"The Gruber case. You built it right, didn't you? It wasn't a flaw in the evidence."
His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "No," he said. "It wasn't the evidence." "Then this time it won't be the evidence either." She held his gaze. "Because this time, the evidence doesn't go through Pinkerton." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hat on and walked out. And Clara listened to his footsteps on the stairs and turned back to the carpet bag and began to think carefully about what 40 miles of creek trail in the dark required from a woman who'd ridden into Silverbend 3 weeks ago, not knowing a soul, and had since learned that the most dangerous thing about Warren Cole was not his armed men, or his locked bank, or his midnight riders to Cheyenne. It was the 11 families who still didn't know what had been done to them. She packed light and packed fast, and was ready before the sun went down. They left at 9:30, when the saloon noise was loud enough to cover the sound of horses moving quiet along the back of Ruth's property and into the dark beyond the tree line. Ruth had stood at the kitchen door and pressed a wrapped package of bread and dried meat into Clara's hands without a word. Then she gripped Clara's wrist for just a moment, not hard, just present, and let go. "I'll keep Cole's men thinking you're upstairs with a headache," she said. "You've got until morning before that story runs out." "That's enough," Clara said. Ruth had looked at her the way she'd looked at her that first day at the stage stop. Thorough, measuring. And then she'd looked at Eli. Something passed between them that Clara didn't have the full history to read. Then Ruth had gone back inside and closed the door, and the night had swallowed the light from the kitchen window, and Clara had followed Eli into the dark. The creek route was not a road. It was a suggestion, a path that existed because water had always known where it was going, and animals had followed, and men had eventually traced the same line because it was there. Eli wrote it like he'd ridden it before, in the dark, without hesitation, which told Clara things about the past 2 years of his life that he hadn't said in words. She rode behind him and kept her eyes on his shape ahead of her, and thought about Judge Harlan Price, and what 40 miles of this terrain meant for the documentation in her carpet bag. After an hour, Eli slowed and came alongside her. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "Your shoulder?"
"Is fine."
She looked at him.
"I didn't injure my shoulder."
"Just checking." He kept pace with her for a moment. "You ride better than you did 3 weeks ago."
"I've been practicing every morning."
"I know. I saw you. First week you were here, early, before the town was up." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. "Figured you were the kind of woman who decided she had a weakness and worked on it until she didn't anymore." Clara was quiet for a moment. And what kind of man decides to watch from a distance instead of offering to help? The kind who wasn't sure yet if his help would be welcome. He moved his horse back slightly to clear a narrow section of trail. Was I wrong? She thought about that honestly. 3 weeks ago, a man appearing at her early morning practice would have felt like surveillance, like Gerald keeping track of her schedule, like Harrison watching Evelyn from across a room. "No," she said.
3 weeks ago, you would have been right to stay back. And now? She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said, "Tell me about Judge Price." Eli accepted the redirect without comment. Harlan Price has been on the territorial circuit for 12 years. He's the reason 3 land speculators are serving time in the Yuma prison right now. Cole's been careful specifically because Price has been watching. But watching isn't the same as having what you need to move. He paused. Price is also the reason Pinkerton pulled my case in Colorado. The railroad had enough political pressure to keep it out of federal court, but they couldn't do it if it landed in Price's circuit. So they buried it before it got there. So Price already knows what Cole is. He knows what Cole probably is. What he's never had is someone who could read the documents and testify to what they actually say. Eli's voice was careful, measured in the way of a man carrying something heavy and not wanting to spill it. A woman who worked in a law firm in St. Louis for 4 years, who can look a jury in the eye and explain what a forged subordinate clause looks like and how she knows it's forged. He paused. That's the piece that's been missing. Clara held that thought for a moment, feeling its weight. She hadn't thought of herself as the missing piece of anything in a long time. Gerald had systematically dismantled her confidence in her own judgment over 2 years, quietly and thoroughly, the way you dismantle something you want to use as raw material. She'd arrived in Silverbend thinking she was starting over. She hadn't understood yet that starting over and starting from scratch were different things. She was bringing everything she'd ever been, including the parts Gerald had tried to take. "He's going to ask about St. Louis," she said. "Yes." "He's going to ask about the investigation, about Gerald, about the forgery charges." "Yes." "And Cole will have already sent word ahead." She kept her voice even. "By the time we reach Copper Falls, Price will have received correspondence from Cole suggesting I'm an unreliable witness with a history of involvement in fraudulent documentation." "Probably." "You knew that when you said we should ride to Price." "Yes." Clara looked at the darkness ahead of them. "And you still think it's the right move because the documents don't have a history," Eli said quietly. "Cole can attack your credibility. He can't change what Homer Bell's X looks like next to a cursive signature. He can't change what the ledger numbers say when you line them up against the foreclosure filings. The documents are the case, Clara. You're just the person who can explain them to a judge." He paused. "And that's enough." She rode in silence for a while after that, turning it over. The creek moved alongside them, steady and indifferent to everything happening on its banks. And the sky overhead was enormous and full of stars in the way that still surprised her about this part of the world. St. Louis had never had a sky like this. St. Louis had buildings and gas lamps and the comfortable confinement of a city that organized itself around human priorities. Out here, the sky just was, vast and unasked for, and you were very small beneath it, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like a relief rather than a threat. They were 2 hours out when Eli put his hand up sharply and stopped. Clara pulled her horse up and listened. Riders. Behind them and to the north. Not close, not yet, but not far enough. "Cole's men," Eli said, barely a sound. "How did they know the creek route?" "They didn't." His voice was low and fast. "They're sweeping, covering multiple routes at once. Standard search pattern." He turned his horse. "There's a cut east of here. Takes us away from the creek and up through the ridge. Longer by 40 minutes. But they won't have enough men to cover it." "Then we go." They moved fast, and quiet fast was harder than loud fast, requiring a constant management of pace and ground and breath,
that left no room for thought beyond the immediate. Clara focused on Eli's shape ahead of her, and the placement of her horse's feet, and the sound behind them that was sometimes closer and sometimes not, and never fully went away. An hour later, Eli slowed. The sound behind them had been gone for 20 minutes, but he'd waited to be sure before he let them breathe. "They'll find the creek trail empty and report back," he said. "Cole will know we got out." "Then he'll move on the families." Eli's jaw was tight. "Maybe. Or he knows if he touches those families now, with Webb's whereabouts unknown and a federal circuit judge 40 miles away, he creates witnesses. He might hold." He didn't sound entirely convinced of his own reasoning. "How far to Copper Falls?" 15 miles. We'll be there before dawn if we keep the pace." Clara thought about Homer Bell, asleep on whatever floor he'd found after losing his home, not knowing that the document that had taken it bore his name, but not his mark. She thought about the 10 other families in the same position. She thought about what it meant to have your life disassembled by language you'd trusted someone else to read honestly. She thought about Gerald. "Eli," she said. He looked at her sideways. "When we get to Price, I want to present the evidence myself. I don't want to hand the documents to you and have you explain them. I want to stand in front of that judge and walk him through every single count." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I know what they say. I built the case. It should come from me." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Price is going to push back on St. Louis." "Let him." "He's going to ask you directly about the forgery investigation, whether you were involved." "The investigation cleared me." Her voice was level. "Gerald's attorney tried to implicate me to reduce his own sentence. It didn't work, because the documents themselves cleared me. My signature wasn't on the fraudulent contracts, because Gerald had been smart enough not to risk that I might actually read them carefully." She paused. "He knew I was good. He just assumed love made me lazy." She turned to look at Eli directly, and the moonlight was enough to see his face. "It didn't. I just didn't know to look." Eli held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, which she would have closed against immediately, but something more like recognition. The look of a person who understood the specific weight of a mistake, made in good faith. "You'll present the evidence," he said. "I'll back the legal framework and speak to Cole's pattern in the territory. Price knows my history with the Gruber case. He'll know why I walked away from Pinkerton, and he'll know what that cost." A pause. "Between the two of us, we cover the ground." Between the two of us. Clara turned the phrase over and felt its particular shape. She'd spent 2 years believing that the only safe way to operate was alone, that partnership meant exposure, that trusting another person's competence meant creating another Gerald-shaped vulnerability in her defenses. But Eli hadn't once tried to take the case from her. He'd offered his knowledge and his contacts and his willingness to ride through the dark on a creek trail, and called it backup, not protection. And the distinction, she was finding, mattered more than she could have predicted. They reached Copper Falls at 20 minutes before dawn. It was smaller than Silverbend, quieter. The kind of town that existed primarily because a federal road passed through it, and someone had built a livery stable, and the livery stable had needed a saloon, and the saloon had needed a hotel, and so on, until you had something that called itself a town. The hotel had a lamp burning in the front window, which meant someone was awake, which was all they needed. The clerk at the desk was a young man who looked at them with the mild alarm of someone encountering 2 dusty, road-worn travelers at an hour when nothing good generally happened. Eli had his badge on, not the Pinkerton badge. Clara noticed he didn't reach for it even as a reflex, but a territorial deputy commission he'd apparently been carrying since before he left Silverbend. which she was going to have questions about later. "Judge Harlan Price," Eli said. "He's registered here. What room?" The clerk blinked. "Sir, it's not yet—" "What room?" "14, but—" They were already moving. Eli knocked on the door of room 14 with 3 sharp raps that said this was not a social call and would not be resolved by pretending to be asleep. A long moment passed. Then the sound of movement. Then the door opened on a man in his 60s, with white hair disordered from sleep, and eyes that were alert in a way that said he'd been waking to unexpected knocks long enough to get fast at it. Judge Harlan Price looked at Eli first, then at Clara, then at the carpetbag in her hand. "Callaway," he said. His voice was rough with sleep, but his eyes were sharp. "It's been 2 years." "Yes, sir." Eli's voice was even. "I have documentation of a federal fraud case out of Silverbend. 11 counts confirmed, probable additional counts under investigation. The person who built the case is standing next to me." He paused. "We need an hour." Price looked at Clara. She met his gaze without apology and without performance, the way she'd learned to meet rooms full of men at Whitmore and Cross. Clear and direct and entirely prepared. "You're the new county clerk," Price said. "Yes, sir. Clara Ashford. I have the original mortgage documents, forged modification agreements, complete ledger cross-references, and a summary brief of the full scheme." She held up the carpetbag. "Warren Cole has 3 armed men in Silverbend. His contact in Cheyenne, we believe it may be your marshal, Webb, has been unreachable for 4 days. If you need to move on this, you need to move today." Price was silent for a moment that lasted long enough that Clara felt it in her chest. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said, "and start from the beginning." She started from Homer Bell's ex. She laid the original contract on Price's table, and then laid the modification agreement beside it, and pointed to the signatures without saying anything. And she watched Price's face do what every face did when it saw the 2 documents side by side. A quick sequence of comprehension, disbelief, and then a cold, settling certainty. Then she walked him through all 11 counts in the order she'd documented them, methodical and unhurried, the way you walked a judge through evidence when the evidence was solid enough to stand on its own and didn't need theatrical help. Price asked 3 questions in the first 30 minutes, and all 3 were the right questions. The kind that came from a man who understood the legal architecture of what she was describing and was testing the load-bearing walls. She answered all 3 without hesitation. After an hour, Price sat back and looked at the documents spread across his table and was quiet for a long moment. "The railroad survey," he said. "How did you reconstruct it?" "The survey correspondence was misfiled in the county registry, I believe deliberately. It was in a box dated 6 months before it should have existed. Whoever misfiled it was probably expecting the previous clerk to not look carefully at dates." Clara paused. "I look at dates." Price looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized from the better partners at Whitmore and Cross. The expression of a person recalibrating an estimate upward. "You said you worked for a law firm in St. Louis?" "Yes, sir. I received a telegram from Warren Cole yesterday evening suggesting you were an unreliable witness with a history of involvement in fraudulent documentation." "I expected that," Clara said. "The investigation in St. Louis cleared me completely. Gerald Ashford's attorney attempted to implicate me and failed. I can provide the case number and the name of the presiding judge. You can have it verified inside of 2 hours by telegraph." She held Price's gaze. "Cole sent that telegram because he knew I was coming. He knew I was coming because he's been watching me since my 3rd day in his town. A man only watches a county clerk that carefully if he's afraid of what she can read. Price was quiet. Then he turned to Eli. Webb? Gone 4 days. No word. I know where Webb is, Price said, and his voice had something in it that was flat and old and tired. Webb's been in my pocket for a year, and Cole's had someone watching my correspondence since the spring. He stood, moving to the window with the unhurried deliberateness of a man making decisions. I've been building toward this for 2 years, Callaway. I had pattern and history and not enough to move on. Miss Ashford just gave me enough to move on. He turned back to them. I'm going to need you both in Silverbend when I arrive. I'm going to need the originals entered into the official record before Cole has a chance to remove or alter them. And I'm going to need Miss Ashford to testify to how and where she found each document and what it demonstrates. When are you moving? Eli asked. I'll have 6 federal deputies riding with me by 8 this morning. We'll be in Silverbend before noon. Price looked at Clara directly. Can you be there before we arrive and secure the original files? Clara thought about Cole's 3 men at the saloon, about Ruth with her steady hands and her locked doors, about 11 families who'd lost everything to language they couldn't read, and a system that had assumed nobody would look closely enough to catch it. Yes, she said. Price nodded once. Then you'd better ride. She was already moving before Eli reached the door, the carpetbag over her shoulder, every document accounted for, the case intact and solid, and built from the ground up by hands that had learned the hard way what forgery looked like, and had promised themselves, somewhere in the wreckage of a St. Louis courtroom, never to be on the wrong side of that knowledge again. Eli caught up with her at the top of the stairs and said nothing, just matched her pace, and that was enough. Outside, the sun was just beginning to clear the ridge to the east, flat and bright and without apology. And Copper Falls was stirring itself awake around them. And 40 miles away, Warren Cole was sitting in his locked bank with 3 armed men, and no idea that the woman he'd been watching for 3 weeks had spent the night building the case that would end him, document by document, signature by signature, all the way back to the first X that Homer Bell had pressed into paper he'd believed was protecting him. They rode hard for Silverbend, and the sun came up behind them, and neither of them looked back. They pushed the horses as hard as the terrain allowed, and didn't speak much, because there wasn't much to say that the ride itself wasn't already saying. 40 miles had taken most of the night, going slow and careful through the creek route. Going back on the main road in daylight would be faster and more exposed, and Eli had weighed that out loud for exactly 30 seconds before Clara had said the road, and he'd nodded and they'd taken it. The sun was fully up by the time they hit the halfway point, and the morning was the kind of clear and hard that made distances look shorter than they were. Clara's back ached from the hours in the saddle, and she ignored it the way she'd learned to ignore most physical discomfort over the past 3 weeks, by giving her attention entirely to the problem in front of her instead. When we get there, she said, I go straight to the mayor's office. Cole's men will see you come in. Yes, and they'll report to Cole that I'm back and going about my regular work. She kept her eyes on the road, which buys us time before he understands what's actually happening. He's going to know something happened. You were gone all night. Ruth told them I had a headache. People with headaches sometimes feel better in the morning. She glanced at him. How long before Cole figures out we went to Price? Depends on whether his man in Copper Falls is awake at 5 in the morning. Eli's voice was measured. Best case, he doesn't know until Price rides in. Worst case, he got word an hour after we left the hotel. Then we plan for the worst case, which means Cole may try to move the original documents before Price arrives. He can't move what's already logged into the official assessment record. Clara had been thinking about this since they'd left Copper Falls, turning it over the way you turned over a problem that had one solution if you could get to it fast enough. I started the county tax assessment 2 days ago. Every document I pulled for that assessment was logged in the official register, date, file number, cabinet location. It's a legal record. Cole can remove the physical files, but he can't remove the register entries without destroying a public document in front of witnesses. She paused. As long as I get to that register before he does, and the entries are complete and dated, the chain of custody is intact even if the originals go missing. Eli was quiet for a moment. You thought of that at 5 in the morning after riding through the night. I thought of it at 3 in the morning. I've had 2 hours to refine it. He made a sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. All right. You go to the office, complete the register entries, secure what you can. I'll find Ruth and make sure she knows Price is coming, and when. He adjusted his hat against the sun. And I'll keep eyes on Cole's men at the saloon. Don't engage them. I know how to watch without engaging. I know you do, Clara said. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at her sideways. Because you're concerned. Because I need you functional when Price rides in, and a confrontation with 3 armed men at 9 in the morning would compromise that. She kept her voice practical, which was easier than examining what was underneath the practicality. That's all. Eli was quiet for a moment. Understood, he said, and the word was simple and without edge, and she appreciated that he didn't make more of it than she'd offered. They reached Silverbend at 8:30. Clara went directly to the mayor's office without stopping at Ruth's, without changing out of her riding clothes, without doing anything that would suggest she'd done anything other than leave early for work. She unlocked the office, hung her coat, set the carpetbag under the desk with her foot resting against it, and pulled the assessment register to the center of the desk. The register was a bound ledger, official territorial property, every entry dated and signed by the clerk of record. Her entries from the past 2 days were there. Every document she'd pulled, every cabinet and file number, logged in her clean, precise hand. She worked through the remaining entries she hadn't completed the day before, dating them correctly, signing each line, building the paper record of exactly which documents had been reviewed and when and by whom. She was on the 9th entry when she heard the door. Cole didn't knock. He walked in the way he'd walked into every room she'd seen him enter, like the space had been waiting for him, and he closed the door behind him with a careful click that was worse than a slam. His 3 men were not with him. That was the first thing she noted. The second was that he was not wearing his banker's smile. You were in Copper Falls this morning, he said. Clara didn't look up from the register. Good morning, Mr. Cole. Don't. His voice had shed the courteous surface entirely. What was underneath was colder and more direct, and somehow easier to deal with, because at least it was honest. My man in Copper Falls watched you and Callaway walk into Harlan Price's hotel at 4:30 this morning. I'd like to know what you gave him. I'm completing the county tax assessment. She made the next entry, dated it, signed it. That's the work I was hired to do. Clara. He moved to the desk and put both hands on it and leaned forward. And it was the first time he'd used her given name, which was meant to be intimidating, and was instead clarifying. Because a man who dropped the pretense of courtesy was a man who decided the pretense was no longer useful. I know what you found. I've known since the day you asked Holt for the bank's quarterly ledgers. You are a clever woman, and I have genuinely underestimated you. And I am telling you now, directly, that you have built something that will not survive contact with the way this territory actually works. Clara put down her pen and looked at him for the first time. Explain what you mean by that. I mean that I have been operating in this territory for 6 years. I have relationships with every significant political figure between here and Santa Fe. I have the railroad's backing, which means I have the backing of every investor and legislator connected to the railroad, which is most of them. He straightened. Harlan Price is one judge on one circuit. Whatever you gave him last night It's going to run into the same wall every other attempt to move against me has run into. And when it does, you will be the county clerk who wasted the court's time with a fraud allegation that didn't hold up. And you will have done it with a history of involvement in a forgery case in St. Louis." He let that land. "I am offering you a way out of that outcome." "What way out?" "Leave Silverbend. Today. I'll provide a letter of reference. I'll ensure your name is never connected to any of this.
You go back east, somewhere far from New Mexico territory, and we never speak of it again." He paused. "You're a talented woman, Miss Ashford. Genuinely. I'd hate to see that talent destroyed over a case that isn't going to go the way you believe it will." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Gerald, who had also told her she was talented, who had also framed her destruction as something that would be a shame, a waste, a pity, always positioning himself as the reluctant cause of a consequence she could avoid if she simply cooperated. She thought about Homer Bell's X. She thought about Price's face when he'd seen the two signatures side by side, and the cold, settling certainty that had moved through his expression. "You forged the signature of a man who can't write his own name," she said quietly. "You used his illiteracy as the mechanism. You knew he couldn't read what you'd done to him. You counted on it." She picked up her pen. "That's not a business dispute, Mr. Cole. That's not a difference of interpretation. That is a deliberate crime committed specifically against people you believed would never have the means to catch you." She made the next entry in the register, dated it, signed it. "I am not leaving Silverbend." Cole was very still for a moment. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. "I've made serious mistakes before." She turned to the next page of the register. "I know what they look like. This isn't one." He left without another word, and the door closed behind him with the same careful click as before. And Clara set down her pen and pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed slowly through her nose for 30 seconds. Because her heart was moving considerably faster than she wanted it to, and she needed her hands steady for the remaining entries. 11 entries. She had 4 left. She finished them in 20 minutes. Then she opened the carpet bag and removed the documentation package. Originals, copies, summary brief, ledger cross-references, and entered each document individually into the register as exhibits attached to the assessment record. Official, dated, signed, a chain of custody that existed in the public record of the New Mexico territory and could not be removed without the removal being itself a crime. She was closing the register when Ruth appeared in the doorway, moving with the purposeful speed of a woman covering ground efficiently. "Cole's men left the saloon 10 minutes ago," Ruth said. "2 of them went to the bank, one standing at the end of this street. Price gets here by noon. That's 3 hours." Ruth looked at the register on the desk. "You finished?" "Just now." Ruth looked at her with the thoroughness she'd shown at the stage stop on the first day. Then she nodded, once, with a quality of finality that felt like something being confirmed rather than something being decided. "Eli's watching the bank from the hardware store. He sent word. Cole sent a telegram to Santa Fe 20 minutes ago. We don't know to who." "It doesn't matter who." Clara stood and put the register back in its proper position on the shelf, the right place, where Price's deputies could find it without difficulty, and kept the documentation package in her hands. "Whatever Cole's political connections can do, they need time to work. Price is already riding. Cole doesn't have time." "What do you need from me?" Clara thought about that for a moment. "Homer Bell," she said. "Where is he staying?" "With the Caswell family, east of town." "Why?" "Because when Price arrives, and this goes into the official record,
Homer Bell is going to need to understand what happened to him and why. He's going to need someone to explain it in plain language.
She looked at Ruth. Can you get him to town before noon? Ruth was already moving toward the door. I'll have him here by 11. She stopped. Clara. Clara looked up. What Cole said to you just now. Ruth's voice was even, but her eyes were not. Whatever it was. He offered me a letter of reference and a way out. Ruth was quiet for a moment. And? I have 4 entries left in a register that don't complete themselves. Ruth's mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. Then she left, and Clara was alone with the documents and the morning light coming through the window and the sound of Silverbend going about its business outside. And somewhere in that business, a man who had decided she was a problem was deciding what to do about it. The next 2 hours had the particular quality of time that moves both too slowly and too fast. Clara organized the documentation for Price's deputies. Clear labels, logical order, the kind of arrangement that made a reviewing attorney's job straightforward rather than investigative. She made a second copy of the summary brief and sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Territorial Governor's office, which she gave to the young boy from the dry goods store with 25 cents and instructions to take it to the telegraph office by 10 o'clock. At 10:15, Eli came through the back door of the mayor's office with mud on his boots and his expression tight. Cole's trying to access the bank vault, he said. His men are moving boxes. Clara looked up from the desk. Documents? Can't see clearly, but if he's moving paper out of that vault, it doesn't matter. She gestured at the register on the shelf. Everything that matters is entered in the official record. He can move the originals, but the register proves they existed and were reviewed as part of an official assessment. Moving them now just adds evidence of consciousness of guilt. She paused. How far out is Price? I sent a rider to meet him an hour ago. He's on schedule. Eli moved to the window, angling himself so he could see the street without being obvious about it. Cole's man is still at the end of the block. He's watching to see when I leave the office. Or watching to make sure you do leave. Eli turned from the window. Cole's not going to move on you directly. Too many witnesses in a town this size, and he knows Price is coming. Even if he's hoping his political connections delay it, he can't count on that. But if you leave this building alone before Price arrives, I'm not leaving this building, Clara said. Good. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from her, his elbows on his knees, his hat in his hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The morning sounds filtered through the window. The hardware store, 2 women talking in front of the dry goods, a horse somewhere getting impatient about something. You talked to him, Eli said. Not a question. He came here. What did he say? Clara was quiet for a moment. That my case won't survive contact with the way this territory actually works. That he has enough political backing to outlast a single circuit judge. She looked at Eli directly. Is he right? Eli was honest in the way he was always honest, without softening. He might have been right 3 weeks ago, before you finished the documentation and got it in front of Price personally. He turned his hat in his hands. Cole spent 2 years betting that nobody would be able to read his records carefully enough to catch him. He didn't plan for you specifically. The political machinery takes time to mobilize, and Price is already in motion. He paused. The thing about evidence this clean is that it changes the calculation for the people who'd otherwise protect Cole. Nobody wants to be the man who backed a land fraudster when the original documents are sitting in a federal court record with 11 forged signatures. Clara turned that over. The railroad backing. The railroad wants the land corridor. They don't necessarily care whether Cole is the man who delivers it or someone else. Eli met her eyes. Clean title is worth more to a railroad company than loyalty to one banker.
If Cole goes down with evidence this solid, the railroad distances itself. Clara thought about the specific cold logic of that. It wasn't comfort, exactly, but it was structural. Something she could test the weight of and find sound. "You've been thinking about this for 2 years," she said. "I've been thinking about what it would take to build a case that held up. What the Gruber case was missing." He was quiet for a moment. It was missing someone who could read the documents in a courtroom and explain exactly what they meant to a judge who'd never seen a mortgage modification in his life. He looked at her. "Price asked me this morning whether you'd be willing to testify at a formal proceeding. Full trial, under oath, with Cole's attorney present." "Yes." "You didn't hesitate?" "No." Eli held her gaze for a moment. "The attorney will go after St. Louis." "Let him." Her voice was steady. "Everything he can allege about St. Louis, I can answer. Gerald made me an expert in exactly the kind of fraud Cole has been committing. There is no version of that cross-examination that doesn't end with me explaining, in detail, how I know what a forgery looks like." She paused. "The worst thing that ever happened to me is the most useful thing I've ever had." Something moved through Eli's expression that was quiet and complicated, and she thought she understood at least part of it, because she'd seen it in her own mirror. The look of someone recognizing that the thing they'd been carrying as damage was also the thing that had made them capable of exactly what was needed. Homer Bell arrived at 20 minutes past 11, brought by Ruth with a matter-of-fact efficiency that Ruth brought to everything. He was a heavy-set man in his late 40s, sun-weathered, with hands that said decades of grain farming, and eyes that held the particular exhausted dignity of a man who'd lost something and hadn't stopped believing it might come back. Clara stood up when he came in and shook his hand. He looked surprised by the handshake. Then he looked at the documents on the desk and back at her with an expression she recognized. A man trying to understand what a room full of paper had to do with him. "Mr. Bell," she said, "my name is Clara Ashford. I'm the county clerk. I need to explain something to you about the mortgage on your land." He sat down slowly. "Yes, ma'am? When you borrowed against your property 2 years ago, you signed the original contract with your mark." She put the original in front of him, pointed to his X without touching it. "That's your signature, yes?" Homer Bell looked at it, and his jaw tightened. "Yes, ma'am, that's mine." She laid the modification agreement beside it, pointed to HOM. "Did you sign this?" He stared at it for a long moment. "I never signed nothing like that." His voice was flat and certain. "I can't write like that. Somebody else put my name on that paper." "Yes," Clara said. "They did. And that's why you're about to get your land back." Homer Bell looked at her, and something happened in his face that she hadn't been prepared for. Not relief, not yet, because relief required believing it was real, and he hadn't had enough time to believe it yet. What happened first was rawer than relief. It was the look of a man who'd believed for 2 years that what had happened to him was his fault, who'd told himself the story of a man too ignorant to protect his own family, and who was just now understanding that the story wasn't true. His eyes had filled before he understood they were going to, and he'd turned his head to the side and pressed one fist against his mouth and sat that way for a moment, very still. Ruth had put her hand on his shoulder. Clara had looked at the documents and given him the moment without comment, because some things needed to happen in their own time and didn't require management. They heard the horses at 11:47. 6 riders coming up the main street at the measured, deliberate pace of federal authority. And in the front, on a gray horse, a white-haired man in a dark coat who rode like someone who'd been enforcing the law in hard country long enough to have stopped finding it dramatic. Clara picked up the documentation package, looked at Eli, and walked to the door. "Ready?" he said. She thought about St. Louis, about Gerald's smile when she'd signed the contracts he'd set in front of her,
About the morning she'd found her desk cleared and her key useless in the lock. About the stage west with $43 and a carpet bag, and the decision to be done being the woman who trusted too much, which had turned into something more complicated and more honest than she'd known how to articulate then. About Homer Bell's ex, pressed hard into paper by hands that had done everything right and been stolen from anyway. About 11 families and a judge who was 40 miles away and then wasn't, because she had ridden through the night and laid the documents on his table and said, "Here is what was done, and here is how I know it, and here is every piece of evidence you need to stop it."
"Yes," Clara said, and walked out into the Silverbend morning with the documentation in her hands and every number accounted for, and Eli Callaway one step to her left, not in front, not behind, exactly beside her, and Judge Harlan Price riding toward them with the weight of federal authority at his back, and nowhere near enough of that weight to account for what Clara Ashford had built in 3 weeks from a desk in a county clerk's office, using nothing but the truth and the ability to read. Warren Cole stepped out of the bank. He saw Price. He saw the deputies. He saw Clara standing in the street with the carpet bag and the documentation, and Eli beside her. His expression moved through something fast and complicated that ended nowhere good for him. And for just a moment, one flat, honest moment, she saw it. Not defeat. Not yet. Just the look of a man who had built an entire strategy on a single assumption and was understanding, right now, in real time, that the assumption had been wrong. He had assumed nobody would be able to read what he'd done. He had been wrong about that from the day Clara Ashford had stepped off the stage in Silverbend. Price dismounted and crossed to her directly, which she noted with quiet satisfaction, and held out his hand, and she gave him the documentation package, and he looked at the chain of custody entries and the register notation and said, very quietly, "Good work, Miss Ashford." And she said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and watched him walk toward Warren Cole and the 6 federal deputies fanning out behind him, and Homer Bell standing in the doorway of the mayor's office with his hands at his sides and his eyes following everything. Eli had moved up beside her. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the whole case." "Not yet," Clara said. "It's not the whole case until he's in front of a jury. But the hard part, Clara said, was always just the reading." Warren Cole did not go quietly. That was the first thing Clara learned about men who had held power long enough to mistake it for permanence. They did not accept its removal as a fact until every other option had been exhausted. Cole had stood in the street while Price's deputies moved toward the bank, and he had done what men like him always did when the legal architecture failed them. He had reached for something older and simpler. "You have no jurisdiction here," he said. His voice was controlled, professionally controlled, the way a man controls something that is trying to get away from him. "This is a territorial matter. A federal circuit judge has no standing to—" "Warren Cole." Price didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You are being detained on suspicion of federal fraud, forgery of public documents, and interference with the official land registry of the New Mexico Territory. Those are federal offenses, Mr. Cole. My jurisdiction is not in question. I want my attorney. You'll have one, in Santa Fe." Price nodded to the nearest deputy, who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before and didn't find it interesting. "Take him." Cole's 2 men at the bank door moved at the same moment, not toward Price, not stupid enough for that, but sideways, positioning, and Eli had already moved before Clara registered the shift. Not aggressively, not with his hand on his gun. He simply stepped into the line between Cole's men and the deputies and stood there, square and unhurried, and said, "Don't." One word, flat and certain, and carrying the weight of a man who had thought through this exact moment
and was not afraid of how it ended. Cole's men stopped. Cole himself looked at Eli with an expression Clara had never seen on him before. Not the practiced pleasantness, not the cold calculation, but something rawer, something that recognized it was finished and hated the recognition. His eyes moved from Eli to Clara, and she held his gaze without difficulty, because the hard part was already done, and what was left was simply the witnessing of it. "This won't hold," Cole said, and it was directed at her specifically. And they both knew it was no longer true, and he was saying it anyway because some men needed the last word, even when the last word meant nothing. "The documents will hold," Clara said. "They always do." The deputy put a hand on Cole's arm, and he went, because there was nothing else to do, and it was over in the way that things built on a foundation of fraud were always eventually over. Not with drama, but with the simple insistence of evidence that had been waiting all along for someone to read it. The next 3 hours were procedural and exhausting and necessary. Price's deputies secured the bank and began the formal inventory of Cole's documents under Clara's guidance. She was the only person present who could move through those records quickly and accurately, and Price had understood that from the beginning. She worked through the vault systematically, flagging every file that connected to the 11 documented cases and 4 additional ones she found in the process of the inventory, bringing the total to 15 families whose mortgage modifications bore signatures they had never made. Price worked beside her for part of it, asking questions that were precise and never redundant, and she answered them the same way, and after the second hour he said, without looking up from the document he was reviewing, "You should consider the law formally, Miss Ashford." She'd looked at him. "I was told 4 years ago that women didn't take the bar examination in Missouri." "Things change." He turned the page. "New Mexico Territory has been known to be pragmatic about such matters when the person in question has demonstrated adequate competence." He paused. "You have demonstrated adequate competence." She hadn't responded to that immediately, because the idea required more space than the vault of Warren Cole's bank could provide, and she filed it somewhere in the back of her mind, where things went when they were too large to examine in the middle of something else. Ruth was waiting outside the bank when Clara finally emerged into the afternoon light. She had Homer Bell with her, and 2 other men Clara recognized from the property files. The Caswell brothers, who'd lost 40 acres between them in the spring foreclosure, and a woman in her 40s with a child on her hip who Clara understood, from the file she'd reviewed at 2 a.m. 3 days ago, was Margaret Pryor, whose husband had died 6 months after losing their homestead to a coal modification agreement, and who had been told by everyone she'd asked that there was nothing to be done about it. Clara stopped in front of them. She didn't have a speech prepared. She hadn't thought about this moment specifically. She'd been too focused on building the case to think about what came after the case was built. But she looked at Homer Bell's face, and Margaret Pryor's face, and the Caswell brothers standing with their hats in their hands, and she understood that what they needed wasn't a speech. "It's going to take time," she said directly. "The legal process to restore title is not fast. There will be proceedings in Santa Fe. You will need to appear and provide testimony." She looked at each of them. "But the documentation is complete, and it is in federal custody, and it is not going anywhere. What was taken from you was taken by fraud, and the fraud is provable. That means it can be undone." She paused. "I am going to make sure it is undone. That is a promise." Homer Bell looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You're the one that found my ex." "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something he's been carrying becomes slightly lighter. "I've been thinking for 2 years that I should have learned to write my name proper. Thought if I'd been able to sign it right, none of this would have happened." "None of this happened because of you," Clara said. "It happened because a man with a pen decided your inability to read made you safe to steal from." She held his gaze. He was wrong about that. Bell was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand and she shook it. And that was the whole of it. Simple and complete. The sun was lower by the time Price had finished the initial documentation and his deputies had secured Cole's records for transport to Santa Fe. Cole himself had been held in the territorial jail at the end of Silverbend's main street, a building that Ruth described as adequate for the purpose, which Clara had come to understand was Ruth's version of high praise. Price found Clara sitting on the steps of the mayor's office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention to it, reviewing her own notes for the fourth time, checking for gaps. "Miss Ashford." He sat beside her, which surprised her. Judges in her experience did not sit on steps with county clerks. "I want to explain something to you about what's going to happen next." "All right." Cole's attorney is going to argue that you had a motivation to fabricate or misrepresent the evidence. The St. Louis case will be central to that argument. He was straightforward about it, the way he was straightforward about everything. Gerald Ashford served 2 years before his release. He has since relocated to Chicago. His attorney, who attempted to implicate you, was subsequently disbarred for unrelated misconduct. He paused. "I have already verified all of this by telegraph this morning." Clara turned that over. "You verified my history before you let me present the evidence?" "I verified it simultaneously." Price looked at her with the directness of a man who'd spent 30 years in courts and had no patience for indirection. "I was on the road within an hour of your leaving Copper Falls. The verification happened while I was riding." He paused. "I want you to understand that nothing in your history gave me reason to doubt the evidence. The evidence stood on its own. The history was simply due diligence." "I understand." "Good, because Cole's attorney is going to try to make you feel otherwise, and I want you to walk into that testimony knowing that I reviewed everything and put my name on the warrant regardless." He stood. "You'll receive formal notice of the trial date. It will likely be 4 months out." He picked up his hat. "I meant what I said about the bar examination." He left, and Clara sat with her cold coffee and the evening coming in over Silverbend, and thought about 4 months, and a trial, and a bar examination, and a territory that had been known to be pragmatic, and the entire impossible shape of what her life had become since she'd boarded a stage with $43 and the decision to be done trusting too much, which had somehow turned into trusting more carefully, and building something out of that care that she hadn't known she was capable of. Eli found her there 20 minutes later. He sat beside her on the steps the way Price had, except that when Eli sat beside her, it felt different. Not official, not procedural, but present in a way that was warm and uncomplicated and familiar in a way she hadn't noticed becoming familiar. "You should eat something," he said. "I know." "Ruth's holding supper." "I know that too." He sat with her in the quiet for a moment, and the evening sounds of Silverbend moved around them. The hardware store closing, someone calling a child in for supper. The distant sound from the saloon that was already noticeably more relaxed without Cole's men occupying the corner table. "Price told me about the bar examination," Eli said. Clara looked at him. "I was there when he said it to you. I was coming out of the bank." He was looking at the street, not at her. "I wasn't eavesdropping. The steps are not a private location." "I know." "What are you going to do?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet. I've been too busy today to think about anything past today." She paused. "What do you think I should do?" He turned to look at her then, and there was something in his face that was open in a way she'd seen it get open very rarely. Not the careful, measured expression he used for most things, but the one underneath it, the one that had been visible for a moment at Price's hotel when she'd mentioned the Gruber case, and briefly at the fence when he'd read Homer Bell's documents. "I think," he said, "that you walked into Silverbend 3 weeks ago, and in that time you identified a 6-year fraud operation, built a federal case from inside the fraudster's own records, rode 40 miles through the night to put it in front of the right judge, and restored 15 families' claim to their land." He paused. "I think whatever you decide to do next, it's going to be something that matters. Because that's apparently what you do." Clara looked at him for a moment.
"That's not an answer to the question."
"No," he said, "it's not."
He was quiet. Then, "I'd like you to stay in Silverbend." The words were quiet and direct, and entirely without performance, the way all of Eli's important words were, and Clara felt them settle somewhere in her chest with the particular weight of things that are true. "That's still not an answer to the question," she said.
"I know. I'm working up to it."
He turned his hat in his hands.
"The bar examination thing. If you studied for it and passed it, you could practice law, right here in this territory. There's not a lawyer within 40 miles of Silverbend who understands land fraud documentation the way you do. There'd be no shortage of work." He paused. "And I'd like you to be here while you do it."
Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why?"
He looked at her directly. "You know why."
"I'd like you to say it."
Eli was still for a moment, and she could see him doing what he did when something mattered, not avoiding it, but making sure the words were exactly right before he used them. "Because I've spent 2 years on a ranch east of town, talking myself out of caring about anything that could be taken away. And in 3 weeks, you've managed to make that position feel considerably less tenable." He paused. "Because you're the most capable person I've met in this territory. And you're honest in a way that's rarer than people understand. And when you rode out to my fence with 11 forged documents and asked me to work with you instead of asking me to rescue you, it was the first time in 2 years I'd felt like myself." He looked at her steadily. "That's why." Clara held his gaze. In St. Louis, she would have been cautious with this, would have turned it over for weeks looking for the mechanism, the angle, the Gerald-shaped thing hiding behind the sincerity. But she had learned something about herself in Silverbend that she hadn't known before she'd come here. She was good at reading documents. She was good at finding the thing that didn't match, the signature that didn't belong, the clause that said something other than what it claimed to say. And Eli Callaway, in 3 weeks of close and honest observation, had not produced a single thing that didn't match. "I'm going to be difficult," she said. "I'm going to argue with you when I think you're wrong. I'm going to insist on handling my own cases my own way. I'm going to be in this office at all hours, and forget to eat supper and come home with ink on my hands and a head full of numbers." "I know," he almost smiled. "I'm counting on it." "And you're going to be overprotective sometimes. You're going to want to handle things for me when I need to handle them myself." "Probably. I'll work on it." "We're going to disagree." "Regularly, I expect." Clara looked at him for a long moment in the Silverbend evening, with the first stars beginning in the east and the smell of Ruth's supper drifting from down the street and the mayor's office at her back, full of a registry that held the chain of custody of everything she'd built in this town from nothing. "All right," she said. Eli turned to look at her fully. "All right. I'll stay." She stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, picked up her cold coffee cup. "And I'm going to study for the bar examination." Something moved through his expression that was uncomplicated and warm and entirely real. He stood beside her, and they walked toward Ruth's, side by side, in the way they'd walked in Copper Falls at 5 in the morning, shoulder to shoulder, neither one in front. Ruth had held supper, as promised. Homer Bell was still there, sitting at the far end of the table with the Caswell brothers and Margaret Pryor and her daughter.
and Ruth had cooked enough for all of them, with the total unsurprise of a woman who had understood since morning how the day was going to end. Cassius Pratt, the dry goods salesman, was also present, eating with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who still had no idea what had happened 4 feet from his pot roast for the past 3 weeks. And the ordinariness of his presence at the table was so complete that Clara had to press her lips together against something that was either laughter or relief, or both. Ruth set a plate in front of her and one in front of Eli, and sat down at the head of the table without ceremony.
"Price's deputies leave tomorrow morning," Ruth said. "Cole's trial is in Santa Fe. Probably winter." She looked at Clara. "What do you need between now and then?"
Access to the Cheyenne Law Library and a copy of the Territorial Bar Examination Requirements. Ruth didn't blink. "I'll have the requirements by Friday. The library is going to take a letter." She reached into her apron pocket and set an envelope on the table beside Clara's plate.
"I wrote it this afternoon. You just need to sign."
Clara looked at the envelope, then at Ruth.
"This afternoon." "While you were in the bank with Price." Ruth picked up her fork. "I've been waiting 3 weeks for you to catch up to where this was going."
Homer Bell laughed at that. A real laugh, short and surprised. The laugh of a man who hadn't done it in a while and was slightly startled to find he still could. And something about that sound, simple and unguarded in Ruth Weston's kitchen on a Tuesday evening in Silverbend, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1878, made the whole impossible shape of it real in a way that courtrooms and depositions and midnight rides through Creek Country had not quite managed.
Eli looked at Clara across the table, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed saying. After supper, after the dishes, after Homer Bell and the Caswells and Margaret Pryor had gone back to wherever they were sleeping, that was not yet their own land but would be, and after Cassius Pratt had retired with his cheerful ignorance intact, Clara had stood at the kitchen window while Ruth dried the last of the plates, and thought about the woman who had boarded the stage in St. Louis with $43 and a conviction that she was done trusting too much. She hadn't been done trusting. She'd been done trusting blindly. Done signing what she was handed without reading it. Done loving in the dark when she knew how to read in the light. What she'd found in Silverbend was not the absence of trust, but its correct form. The kind built from evidence, from careful observation, from showing up every day and doing the work, and watching what a person did when they thought no one was measuring. Gerald had stolen her name and her position and 2 years of her life, and she had come west to escape the wreckage of it. But the wreckage had made her. The 4 years at Whitmore and Cross had made her. The investigation and the courtroom and the cleared desk and the key that no longer worked. All of it had made her into the precise instrument that Warren Cole's precise crime had required. She had not survived Gerald in spite of who she was. She had survived him because of it. And then she had carried what she'd survived into a county clerk's office in New Mexico Territory, and used every piece of it to build something that restored 15 families to what was theirs. That was not a woman who needed rescuing. That was not a woman who needed a man to stand between her and the world. That was a woman who needed a partner who knew the difference, and had found one, at a fence on the East Road, in a man who'd read 11 documents in silence and handed them back and said, "Let's go to Price." Not, "Let me handle this." Not, "Leave it to me." But the simple and revolutionary, us. Ruth hung up the dish towel and looked at her. "You're going to be fine," she said. "You know that." "I know that," Clara said. And it was not a performance of confidence or a brave face worn over fear. It was simply true, the way documents were true. Verifiable,
grounded in evidence, standing on its own. She signed Ruth's letter to the Cheyenne Law Library that night at the kitchen table, in the clean, precise hand of a woman who had always known how to write, and had spent 3 weeks in Silverbend learning what that knowledge was worth.
The trial of Warren Cole opened in Santa Fe 4 months later, on a gray November morning, and when the prosecuting attorney called his first witness, Clara Ashford walked to the stand in a room full of men who had read Cole's telegram about St. Louis and believed it. And she put Homer Bell's original contract on the rail in front of her and the forged modification agreement beside it, and looked at the jury with the clear, direct gaze of a woman who had nothing to hide and everything to prove, and 12 years of professional experience in exactly this kind of room. And she said, "Here is what was done. Here is how I know. And here is every document you need to understand why it will never happen to these families again." Cole was convicted on 14 of 15 counts. The railroad, as Eli had predicted, issued a public statement distancing itself from Cole's methods and expressing confidence in the territorial land registry process, which was the kind of thing institutions said when they had decided it was cheaper to face forward than backward. Judge Price wrote a letter to the New Mexico Territorial Bar Examination Committee that Clara did not read until after she had passed the examination on her own merits, and which she subsequently framed and hung in the office she opened on Silverbend's Main Street in the spring of 1879, not because she needed the endorsement, but because it was a record. And Clara Ashford had always believed in the importance of keeping accurate records. Homer Bell got his land back in February. He came to her office to tell her in person, turning his hat in his hands the way men turned their hats when they were feeling something they didn't have words adequate to. He said, "I hear you passed the lawyer examination." And she said yes. And he said, "Good, because I reckon this territory could use one who knows what an X looks like when it's real." She thought about that for a long time after he left. She thought about the woman who had pressed her forehead against a cold window in St. Louis and decided she was done. Done being used. Done being the readable instrument of someone else's fraud. Done. What she understood now, on the other side of Silverbend and 40 miles of creek trail and a federal courtroom in Santa Fe, and an office with her name painted on the window in black letters that caught the morning light, was that done had never been the right word. Not done. Finished with one thing. Ready for the next. Eli came by the office at noon with 2 plates from Ruth's and set one on her desk without asking, because that was what they did, had done for months. The daily, ordinary texture of a partnership built from the ground up, out of shared work and honest disagreement, and the revolutionary practice of 2 people who had both been failed by the systems that were supposed to protect them, deciding to build something better instead. She looked up from the document she was reviewing, a water rights dispute, 3 families, the kind of case that required exactly the kind of careful reading she had been doing since before she understood what it was worth, and looked at him across the desk, this man who had stood beside her and not in front of her at every moment that had mattered, and felt the simple, specific rightness of it. "Eat," he said. "In a minute. Come look at this." He came around the desk and looked at the document and said, "The date on the survey filing is wrong," immediately, because 2 years of watching her work had taught him what to look for, and she said, "I know, that's the problem." And they bent over it together in the afternoon light of the office on Silverbend's Main Street. 2 people doing the work, equal and unhurried, building the case the only way it had ever been built. One document at a time, one truth at a time, in the clean and sufficient light of everything they had both survived to get here. A woman who had been told her entire life that what she could do was too much, or not enough, or the wrong kind of thing entirely, had come west with $43 and the ability to read.
and she had read her way to freedom. Not the freedom of escape, but the harder and more permanent kind. The freedom of a life built on the full use of everything she was. That was what love looked like when it was done right. Not rescue. Not ownership. Not the slow erasure of one person into the shape another person preferred. Just two people, side by side, doing the work, and the work being better for both of them being there. Clara Ashford had ridden into Silverbend, running from a man who had used her ability against her. Clara Ashford, attorney at law, Silverbend, New Mexico Territory, 1879, had used that same ability to build everything that mattered, and she would use it every day for the rest of her life, and no one would ever take it from her again.